Welcome back to the channel. I'm Ambadipudi Pranav, and today we are going to explore one of the most important chapters of Class 10 history, the rise of nationalism in Europe. Let's begin this exciting journey into the 19th century. So let's begin with a fundamental question. What is nationalism, and why does it matter? Before the 19th century, Europe was a continent of empires, kingdoms, and duchies. People identified themselves by their religion, their local ruler, or their region. Nationalism changed all of that. Let's start with a clear definition. Nationalism is the belief that people who share a common language, history, culture, and territory should form an independent nation-state. At its core, it is a sense of collective identity and pride in one's nation. Now, why did this idea emerge when it did? Several forces converged to make nationalism possible. First, the Enlightenment spread ideas of liberty, equality, and self-determination, planting the seed that people had the right to shape their own political destiny. Then, the French Revolution demonstrated something truly radical, that ordinary people could govern themselves, without kings or emperors. Alongside this, industrialization created new middle classes who demanded political rights and a greater say in how they were governed. And crucially, shared language and culture became powerful symbols of identity, something people could rally around. This brings us to the key elements that define a nation. Common language, a shared tongue that unites people across regions. Shared history, a collective memory of the past that binds a community together. Culture and traditions, the folk songs, dances, and stories that give a people their distinct character. Territory, a defined homeland that a group can call its own. And finally, sovereignty, the right to self-govern, free from foreign domination. These five elements, taken together, form the foundation of nationalist thought, and as we'll see, they became a powerful engine of political change throughout the 19th century. Now that we have a sense of what nationalism means as a concept, let's turn to the historical moment that truly brought it to life: the French Revolution and the idea of a nation. The Revolution of 1789 marks our starting point. The French Revolution, spanning from 1789 to 1799, was the first major event to transform the idea of a nation. Before it, France was an absolute monarchy where the king held all power. The revolution fundamentally transferred sovereignty from the monarch to the French people, a shift that would echo across the entire continent. The key changes it introduced were sweeping and deliberate. First came the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. Alongside this came the Declaration of the Rights of Man, enshrining the now famous ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. French became the common language, replacing the many regional dialects that had divided the population. A new French tricolor flag replaced the old royal symbols. Uniform laws and a centralized administrative system were put in place, and the Estates General, the old feudal representative body, was replaced by the National Assembly. But beyond these structural changes, we must ask, how did all of this actually create a national identity? The revolutionaries deliberately created a sense of collective French identity. Citizens were no longer subjects of a king, they were citizens of a nation. The revolution introduced new terms of identity: la patrie, meaning the fatherland, and le citoyen, meaning the citizen. It gave France a national flag, the tricolor of blue, white, and red. It established the Marseillaise as the national anthem. It created elected assemblies to represent the people, and it even standardized everyday life through uniform weights and measures, like the meter and the liter. This brings us to a crucial takeaway. The French Revolution was the first time in history that a large group of people consciously created a national identity based on shared political ideals rather than just loyalty to a king. That distinction is what makes 1789 such a defining moment in the story of nationalism. Now, having established the ideological roots of nationalism born from the French Revolution, let's turn to the figure who became its most powerful and paradoxical vehicle across Europe: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, who lived from 1769 to 1821, rose to power in France after the Revolution. Though he became an emperor, seemingly contradicting the very ideals of the revolution, he carried those revolutionary ideas across Europe through his military conquests between 1800 and 1815. His influence operated on several levels. The first and most significant was the Napoleonic Code of 1804, also called the Civil Code of 1804. This landmark legal document established equality before the law, abolished feudal privileges, protected property rights, and introduced freedom of religion. Crucially, it was implemented in every territory Napoleon conquered, meaning these ideas weren't just French anymore, they became the law of the land across much of Europe. Alongside this legal transformation came sweeping administrative reforms. Napoleon simplified administrative divisions, abolished the feudal system, freed peasants from serfdom and manorial dues, removed guild restrictions in towns, and improved transport and communication systems. In practical terms, he was dismantling the old order wherever his armies went. This brings us to the spread of ideas. As Napoleon's armies marched through Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Belgium, they carried these revolutionary ideas with them. Local people began to think of themselves as nations, not as subjects of distant emperors. That shift in consciousness was profound and lasting. However, and this is a critical point, there was a deep contradiction at the heart of Napoleon's empire. His rule also brought heavy taxation, censorship, and forced conscription into the French army. This created resentment. People welcomed the ideas of liberty, but they resisted French domination, and that very resistance fueled their own nationalist movements. In trying to spread French power, Napoleon inadvertently gave other peoples the tools and the motivation to assert their own national identities. So with Napoleon finally defeated, Europe faced a critical question. What comes next? The answer came in the form of the Congress of Vienna in 1815. After Napoleon's defeat, the European powers met at Vienna, Austria, to restore order and prevent future revolutions. The Congress was hosted by Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich and attended by the major powers, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Now, what exactly did they decide? The key decisions were sweeping. First, the Bourbon dynasty was restored to power in France. France also lost the territories it had annexed under Napoleon. A series of buffer states were set up along France's borders specifically to prevent any future expansion. The German Confederation of 39 states was left intact, and territorially, Russia was given part of Poland, while Prussia was given part of Saxony. The overarching goal was clear: restoration. The Congress aimed to restore the monarchies that Napoleon had overthrown and to create a stable balance of power across the continent. It was deeply conservative, fundamentally opposed to democracy and nationalism. However, and this is crucial, it could not stop the tide of liberal and nationalist ideas that had already been unleashed. Turning to the key participants who shaped these decisions, Duke Metternich represented Austria as the host, Lord Castlereagh spoke for Britain, Tsar Alexander I for Russia, King Frederick William III for Prussia, and the shrewd diplomat Talleyrand represented France itself. But here is the central irony. Why did it fail long-term? The Congress tried to turn back the clock. It ignored the growing demands of people for self-rule and national identity, and the consequences were not long in coming. Within just 30 years, revolutions in 1830 and 1848 would shake the very order that Vienna had so carefully constructed. This brings us to a key takeaway. The Congress of Vienna is often seen as the beginning of the conservative order in Europe, but in trying to suppress nationalist aspirations, it planted the seeds of its own destruction. Alongside the rise of nationalism, another powerful force was reshaping Europe: liberalism. And together, these two ideologies would challenge the old conservative order in ways that could not be ignored. So first, liberalism emerges. Liberalism stood for freedom of the individual, equality before law, government by consent, and freedom of markets. Its main supporters were the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, who were demanding constitutions and representative government. They wanted a say in how they were governed, and they were growing too numerous and too influential to be dismissed. This liberal energy first erupted in the revolutions of 1830. liberal revolutions broke out across Europe. In France, the Bourbon king Charles X was overthrown and replaced by a constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe. Belgium broke away from the Netherlands, and Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1830. These were significant cracks in the conservative structure that the Congress of Vienna had so carefully constructed. But the real explosion came in 1848. Known as the Springtime of Nations, 1848 saw widespread revolutions sweep across the continent. In France, the monarchy was abolished entirely, and the Second Republic proclaimed. In Germany, Italy, and Austria, liberals demanded constitutions, national unification, and freedom of the press. It seemed, for a moment, as though the old order was crumbling everywhere at once. One of the most significant episodes of 1848 was the Frankfurt Parliament. German middle-class liberals convened this parliament specifically to draft a constitution for a unified Germany. They even offered the crown to Prussian King Frederick William IV, but he rejected it, famously calling it a crown from the gutter, meaning he would not accept power from the hands of the people. The revolution ultimately failed due to opposition from aristocrats and the military. And this brings us to a crucial takeaway: why 1848 matters. Though most 1848 revolutions failed in the short term, they shook the conservative order and proved that nationalism and liberalism could not be suppressed forever. The ideas planted in 1848 bore fruit in the unifications of Italy in 1861 and Germany in 1871. The seeds had been sown. It was only a matter of time. Now let's turn our attention to one of the most compelling stories of 19th century nationalism, the unification of Italy. Before unification, Italy was divided into 7 separate states. Only Sardinia-Piedmont was ruled by an Italian royal house, the House of Savoy. The north was under Austrian control, the center was governed by the Pope, and the south was held by the Bourbon kings of Naples. It was a fragmented peninsula, and yet 3 extraordinary figures managed to forge it into a single nation. This movement became known as the Risorgimento, meaning, quite literally, the resurgence. The first of these figures is Giuseppe Mazzini, who lived from 1805 to 1872 and is remembered as the soul of Italian nationalism. Mazzini believed that Italy could only be truly unified as a single republic. To pursue that vision, he founded 2 secret societies, Young Italy in Marseille and Young Europe in Bern, both designed to inspire nationalist revolutions across the continent. His vision inspired an entire generation of Italians, though it is worth noting that his republican ideals were not fully realized in the final outcome. The second figure is Count Camillo di Cavour, who lived from 1810 to 1861 and is rightly called the architect of unification. As chief minister of Sardinia-Piedmont, Cavour took a very different approach from Mazzini. He used diplomacy and alliances rather than revolution. He allied with France against Austria in 1859, winning the region of Lombardy. Then, through clever political maneuvering and plebiscites, he unified most of northern and central Italy under King Victor Emmanuel II by 1860. And finally, we have Giuseppe Garibaldi, from 1807 to 1882, known as the Sword of Unification. Garibaldi led the famous Expedition of the Thousand in 1860, 1,000 red-shirted volunteers who marched south and conquered Sicily and Naples from the Bourbon kings. In a remarkable act of patriotic selflessness, he handed over his conquests to King Victor Emmanuel II, completing Italian unification. And so, in 1861, Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed King of a united Italy. 3 men, the soul, the architect, and the sword, each playing a distinct and indispensable role in bringing a nation into being. If Italy's unification was driven by romantic idealism and popular uprisings, Germany's story takes a sharply different turn, one defined by cold calculation, military power, and a single dominant figure, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck, who lived from 1815 to 1898, served as the chief minister, or minister-president, of Prussia. He is the mastermind behind German unification, and crucially, he achieved it not through speeches and majority resolutions, as the 1848 liberals had hoped, but through what he famously called blood and iron. military force, and ruthless diplomacy. To understand how he did it, we need to look at the three wars of unification. First, in 1864 came the Danish War, in which Prussia and Austria jointly defeated Denmark and took the territories of Schleswig and Holstein. Then, just 2 years later in 1866, came the Austro-Prussian War. Prussia defeated Austria in a remarkably swift 7 weeks, effectively excluding Austria from German affairs entirely. And finally, from 1870 to 1871, the Franco-Prussian War saw Prussia defeat France, after which the southern German states joined the North German Confederation, completing the territorial consolidation. So how was unification formally achieved? On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, a location chosen as a deliberate humiliation of France, King William I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor, or Kaiser. The new German Empire was dominated by Prussia. Looking at the key features of this new Germany, there was a strong emphasis on modernizing currency, banking, legal, and judicial systems. The Prussian state now led a powerful industrialized nation, and Germany rapidly became the most powerful state in Europe. Perhaps most significantly for our broader study, the process demonstrated that nationalism could be driven by state power and military might, not just popular revolution. And Bismarck himself summed up his entire philosophy in one unforgettable line. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority resolutions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by blood and iron. It is a quote that captures with brutal clarity the transformation of nationalism from an idealistic movement into an instrument of state power. Having traced the political and military dimensions of nationalism through the unifications of Italy and Germany, we now turn to something equally powerful, the cultural and symbolic dimension of nationalist movements, and then to a region where nationalism would prove most explosive of all. Nationalism needed symbols that ordinary people could understand and rally around. Abstract ideas like liberty, unity, and national identity had to be made visible and felt. Artists and poets played a crucial role in creating these symbols. Take, for instance, Germania, the female allegory of the German nation, depicted with a crown of oak leaves symbolizing heroism and a sword. She became a powerful visual representation of German strength and unity. Similarly, Marianne served as the female allegory of France, representing liberty and the Republic, depicted with a red cap and the tricolor. These were not just artistic choices, they were deliberate tools of nation-building. Flags, too, carried enormous weight. The tricolor, in particular, became a powerful symbol of national identity across Europe, adopted and adapted by multiple nations as a badge of revolutionary and liberal values. Beyond visual art, folk songs and dances played a vital role. Collecting and preserving folk culture, like the Grimm brothers' fairy tales in Germany, helped create a shared national heritage, connecting people to a common past. And then, there was language. In Poland, the use of the Polish language itself became a symbol of resistance against Russian domination. Simply speaking one's mother tongue was an act of defiance and national pride. Now, turning to the right side of our slide, the Balkan nationalism problem, we see where these same nationalist forces became most dangerous. The Balkans, encompassing modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Slovenia, Serbia, and Montenegro, was a region of intense nationalist conflict in the 19th century. Most Balkan territories were under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and Slavic nationalities sought independence based on romantic nationalist ideals. Greece gained independence in 1830 after a war of independence, and Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania also broke free from Ottoman rule over the course of the century. But as these nations emerged, the region became a zone of intense rivalry between European powers. Britain, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary all competed for influence here, each backing different factions and interests. These tensions in the Balkans were a major cause of World War I in 1914. And this brings us to the critical takeaway highlighted here. The Balkan region became known as the powder keg of Europe. Nationalist tensions here directly triggered World War I after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. The very forces of nationalism that had unified nations and inspired liberation movements had, in this corner of Europe, created a volatile mix that would set the entire continent ablaze. And so we arrive at our conclusion and quick revision, a moment to bring everything we've covered together and reflect on the full sweep of this remarkable story. Nationalism reshaped the political map of Europe in the 19th century. Its impact was profound and lasting, and we can see that impact across several dimensions. First, in terms of new nation-states, Italy in 1861 and Germany in 1871 emerged as unified, powerful nations, transforming what had once been fragmented territories into major players on the world stage. Second, the end of empires. The old multi-ethnic empires, the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian, began to crumble under nationalist pressure, as subject peoples demanded their own sovereign identities. Third, democracy and rights. Nationalist movements were closely linked with liberal demands for constitutions, civil rights, and representative government. The two forces of nationalism and liberalism were deeply intertwined. Fourth, and critically, World War I. Extreme nationalism and Balkan tensions led to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And finally, global inspiration. European nationalism inspired anti-colonial movements in Asia and Africa in the 20th century, proving that these ideas had consequences far beyond the continent where they were born. Now let's run through our quick revision points to consolidate everything. Point 1. The French Revolution of 1789. This was the first expression of nationalism, introducing the powerful idea of the people as a nation. Point 2. Napoleon, from 1800 to 1815. Napoleon spread revolutionary ideas across Europe through the Napoleonic Code and his administrative reforms, inadvertently planting the seeds of nationalist consciousness wherever his armies marched. Point 3. The Congress of Vienna in 1815. This was the conservative restoration, led by Metternich, which tried to suppress nationalism and turn back the clock to the old order. Point 4. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848. These were the liberal nationalist uprisings that shook Europe, giving us the Frankfurt Parliament and what became known as the Springtime of Nations. Point 5. Italian Unification in 1861. Achieved through the combined efforts of three key figures: Mazzini providing the ideology, Cavour the diplomacy, and Garibaldi the military force. Point 6. German unification in 1871. Driven by Bismarck's famous policy of blood and iron, secured through 3 wars and proclaimed at Versailles, a moment of enormous symbolic significance. And Point 7. Balkan nationalism. The Ottoman decline, the rise of Slavic independence movements, and the resulting tensions that ultimately led to the First World War in 1914. Which brings us to our key takeaway, and it is one worth remembering clearly. Nationalism was the most powerful political force of the 19th century. It united peoples, created new nations, and inspired freedom movements across the globe. But in its extreme form, it also sowed the seeds of conflict that would devastate Europe in 2 world wars. That duality, nationalism as both a liberating and a destructive